We've been looking at God's great salvation story, and we're moving further and further in the story. We're getting closer and closer to the climax. Today's going to be a big step when we talk about King David and about the seed. So what we're going to do is just jump right in and look at this amazing story about the seed. The three themes in God's salvation story: there's God's presence, there's the land, and there's the seed. Well, the presence we talked about, but the problem with the presence is we're not actually able to enter into God's presence. If we do, we'll die. We looked at the land, but we saw how the land ended in failure because the second generation did not do what God had called them to do. They dropped the mission. And then today we're going to look at the seed. Moses appointed Joshua to lead the people into the promised land, and Joshua led them into many battles. But by the end of Joshua's life, you can see here he's gray, he's looking out over, and there are cities that were yet unconquered. Well, that was the next generation's job, but they failed. For 300 years after Joshua died, the Hebrews kept on falling into terrible idolatry. This is the period of the Judges. During these 300 years, the Hebrews would start off worshiping idols, and then God would send trouble to punish them. The Hebrews would then ask God to save them. Then God would send them a judge, almost always a man, but there was Deborah as well, and the judge would lead them into battle and deliver them. And then they would have peace for a while until they again began worshiping idols, and it happened continually as a regular pattern. There were 12 judges, and every time the same thing happened. Sin always ruins everything. I think this is the theme of the Old Testament. I'm serious. I mean, the theme of the Old Testament is sin ruins everything, always. And the fact that God has a plan, a program to deliver us from our slavery to sin. The last of the judges was Samuel, who also served as the first prophet since Moses. That's Samuel there, obviously an artist's picture of him. Samuel led the Hebrews for 20 years. The people, however, decided they didn't want a judge to rule over them. They wanted a king. Now, what's the difference between a king and a judge? Well, a judge has a capital city. A judge has a throne and an army. A judge demands and deserves taxes. A judge can make, I'm talking about a king. I hope I said king. A king has a capital, has a throne, has an army, can demand taxes. A king can make treaties, and a king has political power. A judge, only thing judges do are two things. They judge those who have questions, and they lead people in the battle. That's all they do. So the difference between a judge and a king is big. The people wanted a king. Until this point, God had been their king. And Samuel really told the people, this is wrong. God is your king. He's enough. But they were not satisfied with God. They wanted a human king. When Samuel brought the request to God, God said, they're not rejecting you, Samuel, they're rejecting me. So God sent Samuel to anoint Saul as the first king of Israel. He came from the tribe of Benjamin. Saul became king, and he led Israel for 40 years. That's a pretty long time. He's a gifted leader. He never worshipped idols, but he didn't have the faith he needed to obey God fully. He fell down morally several times. He just didn't trust God. So Samuel had to tell Saul that God had rejected him. And God chose David to be the next king in Saul's place. But remember, Saul was king for 40 years, which is a long time. Now, David was the seed passed from Noah to Shem, from Shem to Abraham, from Abraham to Jacob, from Jacob to Judah. He's the seed. That's interesting, because Joseph was not the seed. Moses was not from the seed. Joshua was not from the seed. Gideon was not from the seed. Samson was not from the seed. Samuel was not from the seed. And Saul was not from the seed. So David is quite different. He is the first really important leader. There was a judge named Nathaniel. He also is from the seed. But he's really the first important leader who's from the seed. David was a brilliant leader. He was a great general. He was a man of profound faith. He was an amazing songwriter. He was a man of remarkable courage. He was just perfect. I mean, David's the one who killed the giant Goliath with a slingshot. David was always doing what was right, even when it put him in danger. He never tried to overthrow King Saul, even though King Saul was trying to kill him. And when he had the chance to do it, David didn't do it because King Saul had been anointed, set apart by God himself. David led Israel in praising God with all their hearts and souls. When they brought the ark into the city, David danced in front of the ark in front of all the people. David wrote the most wonderful Zabur. Between 72 and 74 of the Zabur in the Old Testament were written by David. And I'm telling you, those are very profound. They are life-changing psalms. So deep, he understands God in so many ways. David longed to build a temple for God's presence to dwell in, but God says David's son would do it. So everything about David's 100% right. It almost seemed, I don't know, it almost seemed as if all of God's promises about blessing were about to happen. He's a great king. He's a man of courage. He's a man of God. He's a man after God's own heart. He's a man of faith. He's a man of prayer. He's a man who cared about everyone. Wow. David sounds like he's the seed of Eve. Sorry, most important one. So was David the promised Messiah? As always, sin ruined the story. So David from his rooftop saw a woman bathing. He committed adultery with her, even though her husband was one of his soldiers, a faithful soldier, but he committed adultery with her. Then Bathsheba, that was the woman, sent word to David that she was pregnant. And David plotted how to protect himself from public shame. All right, he's already committed a terrible sin. He's committed adultery. People are supposed to be executed for committing adultery. But David secretly arranged for Uriah and others to die in battle to cover his sin so that David is not publicly shamed. Wow. Then, after Uriah is dead and Uriah's wife Bathsheba mourns for a month, then David and Bathsheba get married. The baby's born. Everybody's happy except for God. So God sent the prophet Nathan, and Nathan confronted David about his sin by telling him about a selfish rich man who betrayed a poor man. It's a great story. And in the story, the rich man took away something from the poor man, and without shame, and the rich man could have taken care of it himself, but he didn't. And then Nathan says, you are that man. You stole Bathsheba from your servant Uriah. David sincerely confessed his sin to God, and God gave him. And I know that it says that God forgave him, and you can see why, because look at David's prayer. Be gracious to me, God, according to your faithful love, according to your abundant compassion, blot out my rebellion, wash away my guilt, and cleanse me from my sin, for I am conscious of my rebellion. My sin is always before me. Against you alone I have sinned and done this evil in your sight. So you are right when you pass judgment. You are blameless when you judge. Wow. I meet so many people who get caught in sin, and you never hear a confession like this. This is straight from the heart. This man truly regretted what he had done. But even though God forgave him, because David was king, God brought terrible consequences on him. And consequences are often there in the Bible. hand in hand with forgiveness. God forgives, but he allows the consequences to happen. David responded to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Then Nathan replied to David, the Lord has taken away your sin. You will not die. However, because you have treated the Lord with such contempt in this matter, the son born to you will die. Here are the consequences of David's sin. The baby died. For the rest of the time David would be king, Israel would always fight wars. It was awful. His own children would rebel against him. His own son would shame him by going to lie, in other words, have sex with his wives, David's wives. God would expose all of David's sins to everyone. From this event to the very end of David's life, everything went very, very bad. David remained faithful, but his sons committed rape, murder, rebellion, incest. Wow. Sounds like they're following their father's example with Bathsheba and Uriah. So the consequences were that his sons would do the same kinds of sin that David himself had done. Sin always ruins everything. Sin always ruins everything. In the Old Testament, that's the constant moral of the story. Sin always ruins everything. Nothing ever lasts because sin always gets in there. After David died, his son Solomon became king, who seemed like he would be the final great Messiah. Wow, Solomon's amazing. He's the wisest of all people. He's enormously rich. Solomon built a beautiful temple for presence to indwell. That's pretty nice. For many years, the nation only knew prosperity and peace because of Solomon. His name means peace. God's glory came down and filled that temple so that no one could even enter. So God blessed this temple that Solomon built. It looks like maybe this is the guy because he's got the wisdom. Maybe he's got the peace. He's not a warrior king. Maybe this will be this incredibly wise king. Maybe he could be the Messiah that'll open the door. But Solomon was very proud. He ignored the commands of God about armies and horses. Listen to what Deuteronomy says about the king, specifically about kings. The king is not to have a large number of horses for his army, and he is not to send people to Egypt to buy horses, because the Lord has said his people are never to return there. But look what happened. This is in the story about Solomon. Solomon had 40,000 stalls for his chariot horses and 12,000 cavalry horses. So this says he's not supposed to have a large number of horses for his army. This says he had a large number of horses for his army. By the way, it looks like he also got some of his horses from Egypt. He just ignored it. It's like it didn't even exist. His pride also led him to ignore God's commands about money. The king is not to make himself rich with silver and gold, but Solomon was richer and wiser than any other king, according to 1 Kings 10. So Solomon is not supposed to be rich. In other words, if God gives him gold, Solomon is not supposed to use that gold to fill up his treasury. He's supposed to use that gold to build the temple. But instead, Solomon taxed the people in order to build the temple. And he filled up his treasury room with gold and silver. His pride also led him to ignore the commands about wives. The king is not to have many wives because this would make him turn away from the Lord. Solomon loved many foreign women because the daughter of the king of Egypt, besides the daughter of the king of Egypt, he married Hittite women and women from Moab and Ammon and Ammon and Edom and Sidon. He married them, even though the Lord had commanded the Israelites not to intermarry with these people because they would cause the Israelites to give the Lord loyalty to other gods. But Solomon did it anyway. He didn't care. Solomon married 700 princesses and also had 300 concubines. Okay, so this is a picture of 1,000 people. All right, that's how many wives he had between his 700 princesses and his 300 concubines. That's how many wives he had. And so I think that's too many. I think it says not to have many wives. I think 1,000 is like 999 too many. Pretty sure. In the end, Solomon fell into idol worship. Yeah. Why? Well, I'll tell you why. Because he didn't think he needed to obey God's law about horses. He didn't think he needed to obey God's law about riches. He didn't think he needed to obey God's law about wives. And because of that, he ended up falling into idol worship. Solomon married 700 princesses and also had 300 concubines. They made him turn away from God, and by the time he was old, they had led him into the worship of foreign gods. He was not faithful to the Lord his God, as his father David had been. Sin always ruins everything. Sin always ruins everything. The best kings, sin always ruins everything. No king, no matter how good, even if they were the seed coming from Eve, would ever be able to bring the blessing needed by the human race. In the end, they were still slaves of sin. In the end, their sins always won them over. Always, always, always. So we need a Messiah who is more than a king, more than Solomon, more than David, more than Moses. And the angel Gabriel told the prophet Daniel what the Messiah king would have to accomplish, because the Messiah king is going to have to do more. He's going to have to do more than David could do and what Solomon could do. He's going to have to do more. Gabriel said to Daniel this about the Messiah: 70 weeks are decreed about you and your holy city. And this is what he says about the Messiah: to bring the rebellion to an end, to put a stop to sin, to wipe away the most horrible sins, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. This is exactly what Moses could not do. He couldn't do these things. David could not do those things. Solomon could not do those things. It simply was not possible for them to do it. The Messiah was going to have to put an end to sin. That's what the Messiah is going to have to do. He's going to have to put an end to sin. He's going to have to stop people from rebelling against God. He is going to have to put a stop to sin, period. He's going to have to wipe away the most horrible sins forever. He's going to have to bring in everlasting righteousness. He's going to have to fulfill all prophecies. He's going to have to fulfill all visions. And he's going to have to open the most holy place so that humans can return to being in God's presence. See, that's what the Messiah's got to do. He's got to put an end to sin. Because what we discovered is sin always ruins everything. So the Messiah has to put an end to it once and for all. That's his mission. And we are told by Jeremiah that the Messiah will make us righteous and he will rule in righteousness forever. This is what Jeremiah 23:5-6 says. The Lord says, the time is coming when I will choose as king a righteous descendant of David. Not like Solomon, not like David, a righteous descendant of David. That king will rule wisely and do what is right and just throughout the land. When he is king, the people of Judah will be saved. Why? Because he's righteous. And the people of Israel will live in peace because he's righteous. He will be called the Lord our righteousness. That's what it means to be a believer in Jesus Christ, because this is Jesus Christ's ministry. God's great salvation is really about Jesus Christ. The whole story is about Jesus Christ. Without Jesus, God's salvation story ends in hopelessness. With Jesus Christ, God's salvation story is an amazing yes. For it is he who is the yes to all God's promises. That is why through Jesus Christ, Amen is said to the glory of God. Jesus is God's yes. If you want to know the answer to all of the promises in the Old Testament, it isn't King David. It isn't Joshua. It isn't the promised land. It isn't the temple. It isn't the presence of God. It's none of those things, because none of those things ever last, because sin always ruins everything. We need Jesus Christ, who breaks the power of sin in his cross, whose blood washes away our sins, who makes us new people who are righteous before the throne of God. We need the righteousness which comes from Christ and the cleansing which comes from his blood. And only Jesus Christ can make that happen. So God's salvation story in the end is only about Jesus Christ. I hope now, as you think about this, this will prepare us for the last couple of messages we're going to do on God's great salvation story. We're going to look at Old Testament prophecies about what the Messiah is going to do. Now, we've seen the most important part, bringing righteousness, putting an end to sin. But there are more things as well that we want to see. God bless you all, and may the Lord be with you all week.